Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Durso, one of the senior directors of the Glansky Institute, and it's my pleasure to be here with you this morning discussing the last movement of the Moonlight Sonata. So I have a lot of information. I may go a little bit more quickly than usual, just because the 45 minutes goes by very quickly. So I wanted to do just a brief kind of overview of the movement itself, kind of the musical content of the movement, just to orient ourselves to what we're dealing with. So if you have the first handout, I separated the information so that the handout didn't feel so cluttered. So you can look at the first one and follow through, and I won't go through everything on the handout, but I just wanted to highlight a few things about the music. So beginning this third movement, I think one of the striking features is the fact that it's not really a melody. If you think of last movement of the Pathétique, it's very melodic. Here, it's just broken chords. So you just have this broken chord kind of theme. And what's holding it together, if we look, is this descending bass line. Mostly chromatic, and then one place it's not, and then bringing us to the dominant. So now we arrive on this pedal point dominant in measure 9, and this dominant goes all the way to measure 14, where we have this fermata. What's interesting about what happens next is that this is called a dependent transition. So he's transitioning us to the second theme, but he's using the material of the opening. So it's dependent on the material of the opening, and he transitions us into this second theme. So when we come here, we arrive in G sharp minor, which is the 5th scale degree, and he substitutes it into minor. So you have this beautiful second theme in minor. Striking moment where we arrive on the Neapolitan chord, which is so surprising and wonderful. So measure 33, we arrive on this Neapolitan chord, which is the flat 2 of the key of G sharp minor. So this brings us, a certain ways until we arrive on measure 43. We begin our closing material. So as he produces this kind of almost staccato-like effect in the closing material, he decides in measure 49 to intensify it. So you get this incredible intensification, not only in terms of the thickening of the chords, but also in terms of the extreme dynamics. Because if you look at the beginning, he's keeping it all very quiet. And subito piano. And that brings us to a place in measure 57 where he begins this sort of coda or codetta-like material. Now this would either bring us back to the beginning, or second time around, of course that's the exposition, he's going into the development. So he starts the development on C sharp major, which is the dominant already of F sharp minor. F sharp minor being the fourth scale degree of C sharp minor. So that's where he's going. So he begins on this C sharp major. And he arrives in measure 71 after he arrives in F sharp minor. Playing around with the second theme. But what's so interesting here is he goes into textural inversion. Right here we have again the Neapolitan, this time in F sharp minor. G major. Is our real indication we are heading back to C sharp minor because of the leading tone B sharp in the bass. And now we're at the recap. So if we skip forward to some interesting things, recap is really very classically sonata form, goes through the same kinds of things, except what's very interesting at measure 116, where we would expect that dependent transition, he kind of splices the music and goes directly to theme 2. So you ending up in no dependent transition, but theme 2. Now, significant thing about the arrival in theme 2 in the recap is that he does not use textural inversion. So he's giving it to you only in the upper voice. If we fast forward a little bit and we go to 163, we begin this transition to the coda with the diminished chords. And now he begins a coda and he reinserts the textural inversion. So great. To really a cadenza-like section. It's the first time in the movement that we have triplets. And it's he uses this in the Tempest Sonata. In this section of the Tempest, this kind of triplet figure. Suddenly we're in triplets, have not seen triplets in the movement prior to that. This descending kind of cadenza-like. And then he uses that kind of codetta-like material to end the movement. Just to give us a kind of frame framework for what we're talking about and kind of context for the music. So I want to go directly into some of the technical challenges and really want to acknowledge and thank Edna Golansky for her supervision and input and knowledge that lent such insight into the technical workings of this movement. Just really prizes. I'm going to share many of them with you. So, to begin the movement, we have to come to terms with where should the torso be placed. So, I just want to make sure I have everything. So when we look at the placement of the music, and I'll show you this from above, if my body stays centered, this is going to be incredibly uncomfortable. I think it's even more significant from the side. If I stay centered and look like this, you can see I really can't get the arm there at all. So what's happening is prior to the beginning of the movement, I'm shifting myself over to the left, like we talked in the first lecture, to the left and a little bit forward. That movement actually is very small, but it's good enough to get me there. Now, once the torso is in place, we have several things to deal with. I want to say first that when we discuss technique in this way, this sort of analytical way, it's not a blueprint for how to learn the music per se. It's not like there are steps, I'm going to outline absolute steps that one does. When somebody comes to a piece like this, like Edna and John and Mary have been talking about, the rotation is an integrated part of the playing. It's not something you go back to, and certainly you would not go back to it exaggerating large motions or anything like that. However, once the technique comes together, it is best kept together. But that doesn't mean that we can't sort of telescope in on an element to see if we're doing that element properly or not. How do we know? We use our knowledge, but we also use the feedback. Is what we're asking our body to do making the passage easier to play or not? And that is a very kind of not a complicated question, because it either feels great or it doesn't. So I want to say, as I'm explaining many of these details, listen to them as if they could be possibly wrong in someone's playing or your own, not that they absolutely are. But I found some of the things to be very revelatory, meaning we have analyzed this passage before, but one of the key things here, if we look at it, is that the rotation, of course, is essential to not stretching. If there's a technique, isolated technique, that means that the fingers are going to be absolutely stretched over the keys, and that's going to be very, very difficult. So obviously the rotation exists. I won't go through every step of the rotation, but one aspect of the rotation that may slip by is the fact that the passage is going up and the thumb rotation is the only rotation opposite to the direction of the passage. Sometimes just sensing that can make a very big difference in how the passage feels. There's very, very little in and out here. In other words, we are not moving wildly in and out in this passage. In fact, there's a symbiotic relationship really between the in and out and the shaping. The shaping and the in and out are working so closely together, particularly here. When I do the shaping, those in and outs really did happen, the ones that I put into the music. The 2 and 3 coming out, the 5 and 1 going back in. I don't feel it as an in and out shift. But if it were missing, it could be somebody feels very stuck at the fall board. But you can notice how close to the fall board I actually am. So I'm not out here somewhere. I'm really very close to the fall board. Particularly here, I want to have my thumb as close to the black area as possible. Because if I'm out here, this is going to be very difficult to get my thumb here. These sound like why would that matter kind of come on, but it does. It really does. When you really are there feeling it, that difference between the thumb being here or here makes this so much better. If we were analyzing it in terms of shaping, one of the reasons I think it's important to understand what happens here is because what we all commonly do in kind of, I was taught this way, many other people were taught, I see it in my students, kind of when the melody goes up, it's an under shape, when the melody goes down, it's an over, and physically the laws of this work don't actually work that way. That's not what makes something comfortable all the time. But in this case, the melody is going up to the fifth finger. So it could be that somebody would do an under shape and an over shape like this. Now, why is that not great? It's not only not great, it's really awful actually. But if I do an under shape, I'm bringing my thumb far away from where I need it to be. So the solution here is actually a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over shape. All of these are consecutive over shapes. So we know with shaping, when we say something like a 5-note shape, that signifies two things. One is the beginning and end notes of the shape. One is the beginning, and the fifth note is the end. The fifth note now becomes assigned number 1. So 5 and 1 are on the same note. Now I start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're consecutive 5-note shapes. That also tells us and gives us a good sense of where the high point might be. I want to emphasize that in shaping, when we do the numbered shapes, it's important also not to be dogmatic about absolutes, like the 3 is an absolute height. Here it is, but in many shapes, there are many, many nuances to shape, and you have to find that through the experience and the guidance of the teacher. Sometimes we have to think in very particular ways to make the shape really work. So although it's a wonderful guideline, I would say it also has its limits. But in this case, we do have the shape. We also have a grouping. We can think in terms of the direction of the notes. Remember that thumb goes to the left, but the notes are all going up. Thumb goes to the left, all going up. So that's some of the issues that have to do with the playing of these notes. Now, another thing here, it's very important that that 2 not have an out. So prior to that, we have had it a little bit out. But right here in the figure, which is the 3rd beat of measure 1, I have to go forward to that note. If I come out, I will not make it to my thumb well. So understanding that we have to go forward on that G sharp is important. Our job is not done when we arrive at the top. We have a lot of demands for ourselves. We have to be able to play softly. And then produce a sforzando from the forearm on the first chord. The second chord is also important because that chord is the chord that sends us back down. If we just arrive here and we kind of play that next chord, we could get very lost in where we're going. Now, the combination of starting there a little bit and the rotation gets us back down very quickly. The other issue that can come up is the confusion in the hands as to what is connected and what is disconnected here, I would say, in terms of articulation. So we have something called the interdependence of articulation. Interdependence is a very broad area. It encompasses a lot of things. One of the things that it encompasses is how do we put different textures together. So in this case, the left hand to me with those wedges signifies almost like a timpani. I certainly wouldn't want to hear it connected in a connected articulation. But that can get very confusing when the upper voice is connected. So what do we do in situations like this? We can feel both notes down, and there's a slight bit of response, like John was saying yesterday, on the bottom of the key, which lets go. This is a let go. It's not a let go high in the air. It's not a let go that curves the fingers. It's not that kind of staccato. We never curve the fingers when we do a staccato. There's a kind of tactile sense of the finger, but it can be very helpful to maybe sort it out a little bit. So that there's no confusion in the hands in terms of articulation. If we move off of that to measure 7, have a particular situation in measure 7 because on the second beat we have a repeated note. It's very easy in a repeated note situation to do one of two things, or maybe several other things, but two common things is not to have the arms settle on the first note in anticipation of the repeated note itself. Of course, the arm can settle so much that there's no rebound, and then it's kind of moving yourself to the next note. So there is that kind of response on the bottom of the key. It sends us, but not high into the air. We try to stay as close as possible, just what's needed. So here the repeated note is accompanied, of course, by the rotation on the same note. You could even say this is a rotation to avoid crowding. That can be very helpful to someone. Also, to mention that the torso is accommodating a little bit to the right, but don't go too far. Why? If you go too far with the torso, it produces a very big torso movement back. So you can see that the torso in this piece, this movement, has to be managed very expertly. Just as much as you need a little bit of anticipating the next direction, and then we arrive at measure 9. Now, measure 9, I first want to say, whenever we hold a note, very often we don't, but in this case we can in the left hand, things to look for are we holding the note with tension? Are we digging? Are we having more arm weight on that note than necessary? Trying to find the minimum amount necessary to hold it down comfortably is really what I look for. The fingerings, I won't go over all these fingerings, note by note, but they are designed to not stretch. Same thing in the upper part. When we come here, this leads a kind of openness to the hand that doesn't feel very comfortable. The thumb going on the and of 3, the third beat there, really allows for all of this to feel very close. Two other features. The shaping coming to the second beat. So I'm starting from the down beat and I'm coming to the second beat. This produces a very, very small overshape to the and of 4. So after the and of 4, we have a tiny undershape. That brings us to measure 10. And you can see after we arrive on the tiny undershape, we go into an overshape. Excuse me, I want to say that again. The undershape is in measure 10, sorry. Measure 10, first beat from the and to the last, so the third 16th note to the fourth 16th. So I'm in measure 10, third 16th to the fourth 16th. That's where the undershape is. So we go undershape and then into a long overshape with the walking hand and forearm needed to get us back to where the thumb is. Let's move to measure 13. In measure 13, we have some considerations with fingering. I want to show you from above. Depending on hand size, it might be, for some people, necessary to use 5 here. For a wider hand, it might be okay to use 4. So that has to be determined with the teacher, what feels more comfortable, the 5 or the 4. We just can't stretch and we just can't twist. So if the 4 produces a stretching or produces a twisting, it has to be ruled out. All right, there's another very subtle thing here, which is there is what I would call an interim grouping, meaning letting go a little bit on the first broken octave and starting a grouping from here that goes in. It's something I would feel a few times, and then probably what we call interim grouping, I would go to the beat. But there's something that feels difficult when you really group from the beat versus there's underneath this other kind of like secondary grouping that's working in the background. It allows also for everything to be very close to the black key area. I'm not coming wildly out. If we move to measure 15, we are in this arpeggiated figure many times already, but this one in measure 15, you have to really pay attention that we must come out here in order to be prepared for where we're going. So if it stays in here, there's no way really to get out in time. So we're starting here, and now we're coming out. The next fingering are to avoid stretching. Now, when we put that fingering in, we also need a shaping. So you can see that the shaping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can take a look at where the lines begin and end and adjust your shaping to those parameters, remembering shaping is very, very small. I'm sure you heard in Mary's lecture on shaping that if the shaping is too big, it can have several consequences. It can wash out other motions, it can stop the fingers from moving, it can pull you off the bottom of the key. So always important that you're relating to whatever I'm doing is making it very comfortable, very easy, very secure. If I do too much of this, I'm not feeling secure anymore. I think the fingering in measure 19 is very interesting because it is a fingering that avoids the most stretch. If you look at the printed fingering, it would require us, if we go to beat 3 in measure 19, would require us to have a 2-5 over that distance. In my hand, and I have a fairly wide hand, that would be very stretched. So at this moment, with using the fingering that's there, you can go over that quite by yourselves, you'll see that you avoid the stretching. Now, as I continue in measure 20, what makes this end, the third and fourth beat, feel really good is not fearing being very close to the fall board. The more out here I am, the more wide the passage feels. The more inside I am, and using John's concept of let go, there is a slight let go from the 2 to the 5, bringing us into that second theme. So those are some very helpful ideas here, combination of the fingering, the shaping, and where you're placing your fingers on the keyboard that can really help this passage feel really very easy. So measure 30. Also, this is a question of hand size and hand width. You know, distinguishing the difference between the width of the hand and the span of the hand. They're sometimes not exactly the same. Sometimes somebody can reach many notes, but their hand is not particularly that wide. In this case here, I think it has more to do with the wideness of the hand. And what I mean here is, I would say that the fingering in 30, some people will need to play 5. If you need to play 5, you have to repeat the 5. So 5, 5, which is not terrible. It can work. You know, there's a shape there, one shape, but you can also do the 1-4. The most important thing with 1-4 is to get off that thumb. If that thumb holds on, that will cramp up everything. You'll be twisted, it will be isolated, it won't feel very good. So getting off the thumb in measure 30. Measure 32, Similar figure, but presents a different technical scenario here. Here we have, once again, if the hand is a little bit smaller, you can do the top fingering in brackets, 5, 4, 3, 2, 3, 5. Or if the hand is wider, you do the lower one. Also, getting off of the thumb. In both scenarios, we do have to move in. So we are basically starting this whole thing more inside. If we started out here, even with a 5, we won't be able to get in time that in a way that feels comfortable. Now, I wanted to go to measure 33, the end of measure 33, which shows a certain shaping. Now, I want to show that if I do an undershape in the 4th beat, I'm going to be pretty far from this thumb. From here, can you see that that overshape, series overshapes, brings me very close to the thumb? So I wanted to say also, there is a slight suggestion. I don't think that the fingering in 35 beat 3 is a terrible fingering, but it seems unnecessary to go 5-3, 5-4, and right back to 5-3. So I think staying on 5-3 is just more efficient. Let's go to measure 40. In measure 40, we're having the scale to the D sharp. Now, if that D sharp is held or connected, it's going to be very difficult to play this octave. So what happens there is, once again, referring to John's lecture, it is a let go, and start new. You can start and facilitate the next passage without a hitch. If we move to measure 49, in 49, we also have some hand considerations. For some people, particularly this chord and this chord may be too wide in that configuration. There is a common thing with an octave with a third that some hands just can't do it. It's not the end of the world to drop a note. But if it does feel comfortable, I can suggest a few things. One is to scissor, to be slightly on the side. Now, when we scissor, that doesn't mean we play off balance. The rotational direction is still coming towards the thumb to play straight down. Now, given that, that might solve it for someone. The other thing that I think is really helpful here is to give a little bit of energy to the end of 3. Just enough to send you more in. We're close to the black key area as it is, but just to get more here, that can help continue the passage. So there might be a tiny bit of time to just get there. It's not the kind of time that you hear musically. It's the kind of time that you allow your body to get there, playing with micro times in between time. So I think that that's a very helpful thing to kind of get there and really feel you're playing from there. If we go to measure 53, one of the significant things that's happening here is your left hand is jumping. One thing that can be very helpful is to realize actually that the right hand is not. The right hand is very close. Concentration can go to the left. So very often in leaps, we know that one hand moves ahead of another, but there are also the variations of space, meaning some things are closer than others. It really helps to sort that out. If we go to measure 57 in the bass, the last beat there, it's very important to understand that we always have to be comfortable and in a good position. So when I play the last beat, the rotation itself is not going to get me to this next figure. What can happen here, along with a slight undershape, is the forearm adjusts closer to the torso. Walking hand and forearm. difference I can tell you internally is very significant. It feels very, very difficult to move to the new harmony if the walking hand and forearm is not there, and quite easy if it is. Let's move to measure 78. In measure 78, depending on what happens in the technique, some of the interdependence might be necessary. If we look at beat 2, we might need an interim sense of the 3rd 16th note to trigger the 4th note in the left hand. So the last 16th in the left hand. So interdependence, once again, a little bit of an emphasis. You feel the notes come together, and then you arrive again on the beat. Moving to measure 83. In measure 83, once again, a walking hand and forearm issue. This, I can't get there unless my forearm moves across a little bit. So that can give you a little bit of relief in that moment. Things change very quickly here. If we go to measure 92, here is very interesting in terms of fingering and grouping. If I look at the grouping it the way I bracketed it, I'm feeling it by direction, all coming down. It's perfectly fine to use a consistent fingering, 1, 2, 5, the whole way. I did feel it also was possible to go to 5, 3, 1. It made this feel very close. But I felt at the end of it, I really appreciated the straightness of the hand going into the new material. Moving on past the recap to measure 163. In measure 163, I think what's really important to pay attention to is we do have these broken diminished chords, and it's important to really express the last note. If I hold on to every note of that chord, I really don't have the support necessary for 5. So I'm moving across and I'm allowing my thumb to come off the key. It's already in the harmony, so I don't worry about that too much. Same thing in the next one. Slowing down on the end there, but not holding onto the thumb. Moving to 171, interesting feature here is that this is now occurring in another register. And what really helps is that the torso moves a little bit over to the left, making room, and that the forearm is close here. Being in this position and with the closest note here makes it feel manageable. If the arm is over here, it's very difficult to get to that G sharp. You can get there very easily here. I'll go past the redistribution in measure 182. That's kind of self-explanatory, and go to 183. In 183, the printed fingering is not a bad fingering. I found the one I put above it to fall into my hand very easily and feel very consistent. So I preferred it. Slight issue in 190, it would be, the very first part of 190, coming out of this kind of adagio. I didn't really like the feeling of the octave and the thumb again. I used my right hand, but I had to get out of there quickly. Very, rather close to the fall board so that I'm not in a collision, but I got out of there. Moving to 197. In 197, you have two different shapes. In the upper part, we have an overshape with a tiny, tiny undershape. That undershape is a particular kind of undershape because it doesn't relocate the forearm very much to the right. It is an undershape, but the walking hand and arm is consistently coming closer to my torso. That's why sometimes it's difficult to determine and analyze these things, because they feel easy and they don't feel like one is doing much. But when you really dig down, it's really crucial that that undershape not go wildly to the right, because it's the right motion in the wrong size. And the size of things, it really does matter in the performance of the thing. Also, just a little bit of ending here. When we come here, bound to be rather excited and finishing on the C sharp. Yes, the music is moving to that C sharp, but physically it's the beginning. The right hand has to know it's leaping, so it's a start of a leap. So there's kind of that invisible kind of comma, and this sends me here. It's important to understand that the left hand doesn't move, and the right hand rolls over the thumb, closest note, the C sharp to the C sharp, the 1 to the 5. Just a way to kind of ensure that things don't get out of hand at the end. So I hope some of these things were helpful to you, and I'm very pleased to see that we stayed on time. So enjoy your lunch.